Leadership is taking people on a journey where there's a vision, guidance and purpose.
Good leaders lead with the heart as well as the head.
Leadership means doing the right thing for the right reason, no matter how difficult it might be.
You're listening to Leadership Unwrapped, a podcast where you will hear from people who are living leadership every day.
Our guest today is Dr. Declan Fahey from UCD, a teacher who has taught in Ireland, the UK and in Italy. Declan is a well-known international expert on workplace bullying in schools, where all our paths crossed, on teacher effectiveness and on queer issues in education.
So Declan, you've provided training for a number of trade unions and NGOs on workplace conflict. This is a field you know quite well. You're known internationally for presenting papers at prestigious conferences, which is actually the first time we met face to face. You were an IRC scholar and a visiting scholar at City University of New York. So for many years, I would have heard a lot about Declan Fahey and would have really wanted to meet him. And I must say, when I finally did get to meet him, it did not disappoint. So I'm absolutely delighted to welcome you to the chat this evening. And thank you for taking the time to chat to us.
Not at all. I'm delighted to be here.
So, Declan, Patricia mentioned many things that you've done and accomplished throughout your career there. And I suppose if it could be summed up, it's teacher turned researcher and academic. So I suppose we were just wondering what prompted you to embark on this career journey.
Well, I think I'd love to say that I had a master plan. I remember people talking about 5-year plans, but unfortunately I had no such thing. And like, I suppose the experience that many people have had, I sort of fell into things by accident. And it was all about the purchase of the house in which I'm currently sitting more than 20 years ago. Because when we bought this house here in the late 90s, the very late 90s, I suddenly found myself coming home from school. I was teaching in a primary school in Clondalkin at the time, very happily. And coming home from school, and it would be 3 o'clock. And in those old days, there wasn't the same impetus towards accountability and writing of notes. And I'd find I had nothing else to do. My sort of afternoons and evenings were lying ahead of me. So, with a level of trepidation, I decided I would do a higher diploma in UCD in education studies, with no other sort of ambition other than to do it. And in fact, I remember sort of on the day that it started saying, this is going to be too hard, I won't be able for this. But not only was I able for it, but the best part of it was that the others on the course turned out to be, and still are, in many cases, great friends. And there was a great camaraderie there. So that when they decided to go on and do a master's, something I'd never really contemplated, I did too. I suppose I'm easily led. So I did, at the time I did my master's. For my thesis, I wrote my thesis on the experience of lesbian and gay teachers in Ireland. And this was in 2002, 2003. And at that time, even though homosexuality had been decriminalised in 1993, it was still a very fraught subject, to such an extent that I was advised by a senior member of my school staff to ensure that my name was in Irish, because at the time there was a newfangled thing called the internet, and you could type in somebody's name, and that then it would come up that I'd written on lesbian and gay teachers, and somebody would think that I was a lesbian or gay teacher, one or the other, and that as a result I'd lose my job. Mm. So after I did my master's, I went on secondment to the Department of Education, and I worked for their gender equality unit for, I think, about half a year. I can't remember how long the contract was. But I suppose it was a niche that needed to be scratched, because I'd kind of caught the studying bug. And shortly thereafter, I began my PhD in UCD. And then, as Patricia said, came back then some years later after I'd finished my PhD as a 2-year IRC scholar. But I suppose, really, as I said, the impetus behind it all was accidental, and ending up working in UCD as Director of School Placement and on one of the co-directors of the PME programme is not something that I ever envisaged. It's something that I enjoy an awful lot. I teach sociology of education, and that's something that I love to teach. But more than anything else, I suppose the part of the job that I enjoy the most, even though I'm going out into schools evaluating student teachers, the part that I like the most is just the ordinary interaction with our students. I think that every institution will argue that they've got the best students. Mm-hmm. So I'm going to sort of champion the cause of our UCD PME students, and also my MEd students and my PhD students, indeed, over the years, who have certainly enriched my professional life and my personal life. And I think that's one of the great, sometimes unspoken about rewards of working within academia.
So are you still a teacher? Is that how you see yourself?
I will never see myself as anything else other than as a teacher. But not only am I a teacher, I see myself as a junior infant teacher. Mm-hmm. I spent most of my teaching career teaching 4 and 5-year-olds. And last weekend, I had the pleasure of having 2 of my former junior infants over here for lunch. A 23-year-old and a 27-year-old. The 23-year-old has now become a teacher himself. I'd love to say that I taught them when I was first out of college. Unfortunately, in both cases, they're brothers. They were towards the end of my teaching career. But again, it's another reward. You know, at the end of the day, teaching is about relationships. And sometimes I think that our pupils or our students don't realise that one of the keys to being a successful teacher is actually liking your pupils or liking your students. Mm-hmm. And when those pupils are 4 and 5 years of age and adore you and, you know, hang upon every single word that you say and also trust in you completely, it's a privilege to work with smallies. And I loved every minute of it. And every year when Christmas comes, and I think back on numerous nativity plays and discussions around Santa Claus, I always get a bit of hankering in my heart for the time that I spent in junior infants. So the answer to your questions, Patricia, I will always be a teacher.
I think I ask it because we've had a similar journey, Declan, and I always see myself as a teacher. I miss it. I'm still teaching. And we're still teaching. That's what we do, even though we're in a different setting. We're still teaching. But I do miss the classroom in school, and I miss the sort of the dynamics of seeing children learn, and that moment when they get something and you know that you've been part of that. It's really special. I think you don't get that anywhere else.
It's also quite interesting because, as I said earlier on, that I'm part of my job is to go out and sit at the back of the classroom and examine or watch young teachers teach, trainee teachers teach, and sometimes, particularly if a class is going very well. Now, you might think it was when a class is going badly, but if a class is going very, very well and the teacher has them in the palm of his or her hands and the children or pupils are really engaged and it's a really interesting topic, I'm sort of holding myself back from not jumping into the middle of it because I can see that energy, that positive energy. You can see the learning taking place. You can see the to and fro between the teacher and the pupils, and you can see the real level of engagement. And it's such a special thing to witness, but it's even more special when you're party to it. And I sometimes feel a little bit cheated sitting at the back because it's not my role to get involved. I'm delighted that it's taking place, but it would be that, as I said, that itch that I'd love to be part of that again. So I'm with you there, Patricia.
Yeah, no, I get it too. And I think there's an excitement in a classroom that it's tiring, it's a lot of work. People don't think about what it's like to be one person with 20 or 30 other people's energy coming at you in one room at the same time, and you're trying to keep everybody moving forward and learning. It's exhausting. But I just get really excited down the back of the room when I'm doing it, and I want to get up and be part of it.
It's interesting because I suppose from a research perspective, from an academic perspective, the common thread that has been throughout all of my work, be it with workplace bullying or queer issues in education or even research methodologies, is the focus on teaching as work. Because, I believe, that there's a lot of talk and research and discourse around things like evaluation and teaching and learning and the quality of teaching and accountability, all the topics that are covered in initial teacher education and mostly in many postgraduate courses as well. But sometimes for outsiders looking in, they forget that fundamentally teaching is work. It's something that people do over X number of years to earn a living. And like any workplace and like any type of work, there are pros and cons. And we talked about some of the fantastic pros of being a teacher. But it's not necessarily that we need to go necessarily straight to the dark side to talk about the cons. But there are grey areas in between the positives and the negatives of just where it's just your job. That doesn't in any way dilute the wonderful pastoral caring side of teaching. But one of the reasons we have trade unions, one of the reasons that people, I suppose, sometimes feel a bit disenchanted is that ultimately it is a job. And that's why sometimes I get a little bit annoyed with the whole notion of teaching as a vocation, because I think that when you talk about it as a vocation, you undermine the very notion that we can't, as teachers, we can't always give that extra without something being given back to us. We're not superhuman. And the vocation implies a level of almost spiritual fervour in your role. But for most teachers, when they go home at the end of the day, it's to go home and go into Lidl and do the shopping, try and think of something new to cook for the dinner, cook the dinner, maybe do homework with their own kids or bathe them, get them ready for bed, put them to bed, watch something on Netflix, and then fall into bed exhausted before you do it all over again the following day. And that's hard. Now, it's hard for every job. I'm not saying that teaching is harder than any job. I'm not big into that whole hierarchy of awfulness attached sometimes to professions. I'm just saying it is hard. It is challenging and it is difficult. And that's why people get tired. But ultimately, it's your job. And there are roles and responsibilities in our organisations, in terms of in our schools and within the Department of Education, towards teachers as employees.
The bit that worries me about the not thinking about it as work means that we don't always have the protections of the workplace in the school when things begin to go awry.
Yeah, I was just going to ask you, where do you think that idea comes from? Do you know the distinction between kind of traditional work and then that idea that you mentioned, Declan, of teaching as a vocation?
Well, I remember. Well, there was always an element of teaching in particular, but also nursing, which interesting, like are quite highly feminized professions. So, I mean, there might be a little bit of unpacking to do there. But I remember when I went to Mary I in 1985, and I remember a neighbour congratulating me on getting the call. And it was like a capital T for then, a capital C for call, because it was the call to training. Because there was this idea that you had, in the same way as you would be called to the priesthood or to become a nun, being called to the teaching profession, particularly the primary school teaching profession, implied that there was something otherworldly about it. The problem with that is that it causes a blurring of boundaries. Because if you are working in another job and you're paid to work 5 hours a week or 5 hours a day and that it's €100 an hour, well then when those 5 hours are up, that's the end of your responsibility. And you go home and you come back in the following day and you do another 5 hours and you get your €500. If there's an element of vocation, well then there's a sort of a pressure to continue on to do things that are above and beyond the call of teaching as a job. So there were things like unspoken expectations around, for example, training the local football team, or getting, playing the organ in the local church, or, getting involved in the local drama society, but particularly related to sporting or religious events. And the question we would have now is that whilst many teachers were very, very happy and loved getting involved in those extracurricular community endeavours, and those were hugely part of their personal lives, and they did that with absolute joy and without any begrudgery, how free individuals were to say no would be the question. It's a question we won't ever really be able to answer. But that if you didn't want to play the organ in the church, if you weren't happy about passing on the faith of the individual school in which you were teaching, if you didn't share the values of the ethos of the school patron body, but you were working in that school because of lack of choice or because for historical reasons, how free and safe you felt to disengage or to disagree. And I think that I suppose highlights the tension between a vocation and teaching as a job.
I know when I'm a graduate of Mater Dei, and it was the same. We talked about the professional formation. It was almost like that same vocational language that we used, that was what was happening in terms of your training. And we used the language of training. Gosh, you couldn't say training now. It's not a word you can use in the Academy for Teacher Education. But there was that sense that you were being formed into a particular disposition and way of being, and that was the way you were to be as a teacher. And I think for me, the growing up professionally has been to unlearn that and to move into that more independent and critical thinking space in order to be able to support my own development, but the development of the profession.
I think too that there was also a sort of an implied message in terms of the teachers, the local teacher as a local role model. That again, challenging the notion of teaching just as a job. That there was an expectation around your behaviours, around your actions, around your attitudes, around your viewpoints, around the way that you presented yourself. That particularly in rural areas, that you were expected to manifest a type of appropriateness that again many teachers were very, very happy to do. But the question I would have been, if you didn't feel you wanted to adopt or follow a traditional path in life for whatever reason, it doesn't always have to be extreme. Supposing you just wanted to dye your hair pink and have 50 earrings and 5 nose rings and get covered in tattoos, how acceptable that would have been, say, 10 or 20 years ago in rural communities if you were a local teacher, and even more so further back.
Yeah, well, it's an additional pressure regardless, isn't it? Whether it's, a lifestyle that you would naturally lead or not.
Yeah. Absolutely. Well, I think it's I've said this to our own students that I think that the challenge currently is around social media, that there's always a curiosity, particularly amongst pupils, but sometimes amongst parents too, about the private lives of teachers. And I would always warn our own PME students to be very careful around their social media accounts and what kind of photographs they put up, because I think that there still is a level, an expectation around their behaviours that they act appropriately. Now, who deems and determines what is appropriate is a huge question. And are those expectations the same for somebody who's working in an accountancy firm or somebody who's working in the bank? I think that's open to debate, and I'm not 100% sure how much that has changed. And by that I mean I genuinely don't know. I think it would be an interesting discussion, and it might be one that I'll be having with my own PMEs in sociology over the next weeks to come.
So, can we chat a little bit about your research on workplace bullying? I think that's where I first came across you as a researcher. And certainly the papers that I was reading at that time resonated with how I understood what was happening, especially in school staff rooms. And I think you've had a career of firsts in many ways, Declan, around being the first really to put out the papers in this field, to really look in depth at what was happening in the dynamics between teachers. Also the first to put out the paper on toxic leadership in the country as well. So can you tell us a little bit about why you wanted to do that research, and maybe what are the learnings from it that we need to be thinking about?
Again, I suppose it came from there was a sort of an evolution in terms of research from my master's, as I said, on lesbian and gay teachers and how they negotiated work. And when I was thinking about doing a PhD, the whole idea of teaching as work, but not just for lesbian and gay teachers, but for any teacher where that workplace isn't safe, where there are dynamics within that workplace that are unhealthy. And like many of us, I was aware through the grapevine of schools where there was deeply inappropriate behaviours taking place, actually across a number of fora. And I was aware in the ether of schools where, nobody spoke to one another, where staff meetings were rife with tension and stress, where tears and walkouts were quite common. And I knew of friends who were out of work. And at the time, it wasn't stress. I don't remember the word stress being used, but they were out of work, and there was a sort of it wasn't unspoken. There was a shame attached to that, what we would now call stress, being out of work due to work-related stress. certainly back in the when I was starting to consider this area, it was that there was something wrong with you, that you couldn't cope with the sort of, in inverted commas, normal day-to-day thrust of cut and thrust that happens in any workplace. But I was unsure because I had read a little bit before I started my PhD, and there was a suggestion that schools were particularly bad, that school spaces were that the prevalence of workplace bullying in schools was higher than other institutions or other workspaces. That's still a little bit contested. But what we can say is that at the very least, schools, you're as likely to be bullied you're as likely to be bullied in a school as you are anywhere else. That's the best case scenario. And some researchers would argue that you're more likely. So I started on that road looking at, and I interviewed, I spent the summer of 2007, 2008, travelling the length and breadth of Ireland, interviewing individuals who had experienced workplace bullying. And as I get older, and I was thinking about some of the examples recently for another lecture, and I was thinking back, and I looked back at my thesis, which is something actually academics never do. You never look back at your PhD thesis.
No, you don't.
But I did because I couldn't remember some of the stories. And as I was reading through it, I read through the data chapters to remind myself. And I found myself getting shocked again because I remembered again what had happened. And what bothers me now is that, I did finish my PhD in 2010. So, 12 years later, I'm still hearing variations on the same stories, and in many cases, worse stories. I'm hearing people experiencing having experiences in schools at both a second level, primary level, and third level, which would, if I had any hair left, would make that hair curl. And it bothers me that despite years of academic research, despite an acknowledgement amongst the trade unions and an acknowledgement amongst, various government parties and governments of their understanding and their recognition of workplace bullying as a hugely negative force, that people are still experiencing that on a daily basis. The idea that tomorrow morning somebody will get into a car wanting to vomit because of what they're going to, or what they fear they're going to experience, and may well experience, over the course of their day in their school. That there are multitudes of people, men and women, young and old, tall and short, all types of people going into work afraid they're going to vomit, feeling literally sick with fear, who won't sleep tonight because of something that happened today. And that despite all of the work that has been done, and really, really great work, by so many people and advocates, that they feel powerless. And they feel that they won't be believed, and they feel that they won't be listened to. And I think if there's anything to spur the likes of all three of us who are engaged in workplace bullying research, to spur us on, to keep on picking this scab, it is that realisation, that acknowledgement that we won't be able to resolve and solve everybody's problems, but we might be able to solve some. We might make it easier in terms of the development of policy, or at least having the conversations and saying the word out loud. I think that that's the difference that we can make in the short term, with a hope that it'll make an improvement in the long term.
I think starting these conversations is hugely important alone in itself, as well as all of the amazing research that is going on, as you say. But something you touched on there that I'd just like to kind of pick your thoughts on a bit more deeply is, why do you think school settings are so fraught with workplace bullying? And I know, as you say, some researchers argue that it's, more prevalent in a school setting than other settings, and at the least that it's, just as likely. But I don't know, did you see it? Patricia and I were chatting earlier about the article in the Irish Examiner that, half of teachers have seen colleagues being bullied, on a regular basis, and many other frightening statistics. So we know that it is there to some extent. And why do you think it's...
I think, well, both of you would be familiar with this, is that we those of us engaged in workplace bullying research always view prevalence studies where you're talking about percentages and numbers with a level of skepticism is too strong a word, but we have a slight reservation around the importance of context and around the importance of definitions. Because for many years, well, in the early years of workplace bullying research, there were studies coming out from all over the world about, 20% of people working in construction are experiencing workplace bullying, or then another one would say 5%, another one would say 8%, and, teaching people working in the bank, and, the headlines then in the paper would be, oh, you're going to be bullied, you're 50% chance of being bullied if you work in the bank. And then, the unpicking of that led to realization that people were using widely different definitions of bullying and different criteria for inclusion or exclusion in such studies. So, for example, some were saying that you needed, in order to say that you had been bullied, you need to have been bullied 6 times over 6 months. So all these sort of arbitrary criteria, variables were included in terms of what constitutes workplace bullying. There's also an issue around those employed in the public sector are more likely to report experiencing workplace bullying or harassment, and that may be linked to job security. Women are more likely to report workplace bullying. By and large, again, there's contradictory evidence on that as well, but women may be more likely to report bullying because for many men, such reports may be viewed as in some way diminishing their masculinity, and it's linked to a sort of a toxic masculinity and expression of being a man and being able to stand up for yourself. So there are a lot of variables in terms of how prevalent workplace bullying is in schools. Having said all of that, we do know that it's a significant problem and that there are large numbers of people experiencing it. Why that's the case, again, there have been many, many reasons suggested. I think, for example, things like the lack of mobility within schools, so that teachers often, will be appointed to a school and will stay there many years. That lack of mobility may lead to situations whereby histories and territories become hugely important. So in other words, Niamh, I've been teaching with you for 20 years, and I remember 19 years ago you said something to me that offended me. And we're still working in the same school, and I've never forgotten that. That's our history. Our territory could be that, well, actually, I'm in charge of the PE locker downstairs, and don't you come near it, because I remember before you tried to put some of your computer stuff into that PE locker, and I remember that. That's my territory. So the lack of mobility in its own right and histories and territories certainly will impact. Other issues too are around, certainly in the past, and much less now, there was an idea that teachers worked in splendid isolation. Now, I know this has changed in terms of SNAs and resource teachers coming into classrooms. But that teachers certainly in the past worked alone an awful lot and had huge degrees of autonomy, particularly within a hierarchical structure like a school where you have a principal, deputy principal, assistant principals, permanent teachers, temporary teachers, SNAs, and pupils. And now we can do the whole argument about how appropriate that is for another day, but that's often how schools are viewed. And high levels of hierarchy can cause issues around how power is exercised within the school. There's also issues then around management, in that schools in Ireland, certainly, and also the UK, even though we use a different phrase, being run by a board of management. Boards of management are fantastic voluntary groups from the local community. But they're voluntary and they're transitory, and most are untrained for the role. And all of that is, as a former chair of a board of management, I'm absolutely aware of the amount of time and effort members of boards of management put into the running of every school around the country. But the board of management is the teacher's employer. Teachers aren't employed by the Department of Education. And that's all very well until there's a complex HR issue like workplace bullying. And suddenly, somebody who is your neighbour or your local newsagent or your local plumber is party to deeply personal issues about your workplace or about you, and whether or not they have the skills to resolve those problems that highly trained and experienced HR departments in large institutions would struggle with is questionable. So that also contributes. So the answer to your question, Eve, is that I don't think there's any one factor. I think that there are a variety of factors that shape the experience of workplace bullying in schools and contribute to the reality that many teachers are uncomfortable and unhappy and don't feel that their work contributes towards their own dignity and respect.
I think leaders seem to be really challenged in this space. So school principals, middle leaders seem to struggle in this space. You know, they in terms of resolving these issues, if there are two teachers that are in difficulty, it's variable.
I think that's 100% the case. I think there are two issues. The first issue is that bullying issues, like in the same ways, are very difficult to resolve between pupils. Bullying is really difficult to resolve, particularly if one or both parties doesn't want it resolved. In other words, if people have dug their heels in, it's a very, very difficult thing to resolve, because many of the particularly within the framework of mediation resolutions are predicated on the idea that one or both parties are open to change and are open to forgiveness and are open to acceptance that either they were in the wrong or that they need to in some way dilute or diminish their own requirements in order for things to be resolved, that they need to compromise, in other words. But that isn't always the case. So I think that the principals struggle because they at times don't have the resources and the supports that they themselves need, particularly in terms of knowledge of policy, procedure and law, in terms of resolving workplace bullying disputes. And I think that if there were any principals or leaders listening to this, it's really important that if a bullying dispute rears its ugly head within a school, that after trying to resolve it informally and documenting that effort, that you go to your school policy and you adhere to it as strictly as you possibly can. Policies in their own right won't necessarily resolve it, but if the principal wants to protect themselves and their schools, as well as to behave justly and fairly, then they need to follow the policy as is written down to the letter of the law. And I've seen more cases of difficulties being escalated because school management has decided to skip a stage of their staged progress through the escalation model through the dispute, or because they haven't given due process to both parties to vindicate their own rights. The other issue I would say around the challenge for principals and for leaders, in the school, is that they themselves are often targets of such behaviour. And that's a very, very tricky one, because it's particularly the case for newly appointed principals or newly appointed leaders, especially when unsuccessful candidates within the school remain in that school. And I've come across a relatively large number of cases where that has happened. Because what will happen is that the new principal will arrive into the school full of the joys of spring to find that a cohort has been coalesced against him or her by the unsuccessful party, who will use their own long-standing relationship to undermine the authority of that principal. And it mightn't necessarily be full-scale traditional bullying, but it may be a drip undermining of people not cooperating, people not volunteering, people just not giving somebody a break when they make an error, just not giving the support a newly appointed leader will need in any context. So principals are just as vulnerable to such dynamics as any member of staff is.
I think the old expression, constant dropping wears a stone, which is often said around this house, really, really is true in terms of how you can undermine somebody whose intentions are really good. But if you have a disenfranchised sitting tenant who isn't happy that somebody new has come in, it can really change the culture of that staff. And it's very hard to recover from that, very hard to pull it back.
Well, you see, the thing is that often in a school where there's a particularly difficult member of staff, for whatever reason, and, perhaps the whole school body is hoping that that person will retire or leave, and they finally do, there's a belief that well, now the problem is resolved. We're all fine. We'll all be happy now. But nature abhors a vacuum. And sometimes behaviours, particularly toxic behaviours, can become so deeply embedded within the school that only outsiders or newly appointed staff can see them. So that it may become, for example, that within a school that there is a clique, there's a group who have got a disproportionate amount of power and in the way that the school is managed. And that even when the principal changes, that clique will continue to exercise high degrees of power, even with the new principal. And will also influence newly appointed teachers or even PME students. We've had this with us, where we've had disenfranchised, discontent teachers telling our PME students, don't be bothered listening to those in UCD, they know nothing. And it's not that I would be advocating that we know everything, but it's just this idea of, rather than trying to encourage somebody, it's sort of saying, well, actually, we know better here. And that's a really dangerous dynamic to develop, and it festers within the school.
So to flip this slightly, your paper on toxic leadership, which I was really thrilled to see come out and be published, because I think it's the first, certainly in the country, where we're looking at this type of dynamic, and my own work is leading on from that now, so it's quite inspiring from that perspective. Can you just give us one or two notes of what's going on there? What was going on there when you published that piece of work?
Well, the paper is on toxic leadership in higher education. And again, it was something that whilst, I've always been interested in teaching as work, and I see, lecturing when we're delivering a lecture in a university, we never say we're lecturing, we always say we're teaching. So I see it the work as being fundamentally similar. And a number of scholars had been writing internationally on toxic leadership in higher education. And I'd been sort of skirting around it, and had been at a number of conferences where I'd set up papers that had been presented on the topic. And again, I was familiar from the grapevine of schools and departments within a variety of higher education institutions where there were considerable tensions. So I knew that existed. And it was, again, I suppose some of this happened almost by accident. I put out a tweet asking, basically saying, testing the waters. And it had something like 75,000 reads. And I got contacts from all over the world, even though I was only tentatively saying, I might do something on toxic leadership in Ireland. It came from all over the world. And I had like 2- and 3-page letters, or emails, I should say. Months later, it was still coming in. And it was retweeted all over the place. So I knew that there was a rich vein there, and that there were a lot of stories to be told. So I spent a Christmas, the 2 weeks after teaching time finished, before the Christmas holidays, travelling around interviewing people. And then I did interviews on the phone, and I interviewed at the time on Skype before we had Zoom. And I've actually done a few further interviews subsequent since that paper has been published, with a view to writing a second paper. What surprised me more than anything else was how, though the furniture and the decoration has changed and the language has changed, the experience is exactly the same. It's exactly the same whether you're teaching 4-year-olds or whether you're teaching PhD students in a prestigious university in Ireland. As I said, the contexts, you're talking about boardrooms perhaps instead of staff rooms, and you're talking about lecture theatres instead of classrooms. But the experience and the trauma is identical. And also, the slight difference, and I think this was something that I wanted to highlight within the paper, is that, and this will slightly contradict what I said myself earlier on. Earlier on, I was saying that schools are run by boards of management who may not have the skills that a large organisation will have in terms of HR. But what the study that I had done, and subsequent findings too on subsequent interviews, would reveal that even large organisations like universities, who have very highly populated, highly skilled HR departments, mess up considerably and serve to compound negative experiences of workplace bullying. And certainly that the success of higher educational institutions in resolving workplace bullying or sexual harassment amongst staff or amongst students is quite poor. And that indeed that employees and students within the organisations themselves still feel powerless, fearful that, for example, they'll be passed over for promotion for employees, or that in some way that it will impact upon their academic results for students. And as a result, they'll either stay quiet or let complaints drop. So I think that drove me towards the idea of looking at toxic leadership broadly and at the failure of HR departments to address it effectively or with any level of commitment, because what it revealed was a belief amongst those interviewed that the HR department is working for the employer, and that any rhetoric or any language that they employ which suggests that they are in fact supporting the target of this behaviour is a deliberate technique employed by HR departments to encourage the person who's experienced the negative behaviour to either drop the complaint or to leave the institution. So that's where that whole issue around toxic leadership came from. And I think that, again, there may be linked to the idea that within academia, that you become a leader often on the basis of the number of papers that you've published and the number of grants that you brought in, both of which are actually quite solitary activities. And your ultimate reward for that could be the visiting upon you of being charged as head of school, being made head of school. And being head of school obviously requires a completely different set of skills. Now, that does not mean by any stretch of the imagination that an academic can't be a successful leader. And I know many academics who are very successful leaders, but it isn't a given. So you have somebody who has published X number of papers and brought in X amount of money, suddenly put into a bear pit with all the fraught issues that are in any leadership role, while at the same time they still have the responsibility of continuing their own academic work. So being a leader in academia isn't easy.
No, I think it's really complicated, and I suppose over the years, the research that we've done in relation to workplace bullying and incivility in higher education has led me to a really sort of more cynical note about how HR can manage these and how policy is actually used in a variety of different ways to actually subvert what really needs to happen in relation to dealing with workplace bullying. There's no easy answers to it, but it certainly requires courage.
Well, I think that's quite an important point around policies and procedures, because if you go onto the HR, the website of any major university in Ireland, and you look at their dignity and respect policy or their workplace bullying policy or their sexual harassment policy, whatever they call it, there are two things I'd invite anybody to do. First of all, is to look at the language used and see how legalistic, see how convoluted sentences are. Look at the words and terminology that is used and see how adversarial the whole process is. Don't for one moment think that that isn't deliberate. If you think then of, for example, some migrant worker who's working as a cleaner in those same institutions, or who's working in the kitchen in a cafe in a university, or as a groundsman outside, somebody who's Irish, may not necessarily be migrant, who's Irish maybe doesn't have the benefit of powerful or strong literacy skills. How in the name of goodness are they going to be able to navigate such policies and procedures? There's an implication, there's a belief, not a belief, because I would be even more cynical than you, but in order to navigate those, first of all, you'd want to be the fullest of your health, which you're not if you're a target of bullying or sexual harassment. You'd want to have huge amounts of time to pore over it to ensure that you fully understand it in terms of the policy or procedures. And then you're terrified that if you engage in this whole process, that it's going to have a negative impact upon you, and there is nobody there to reassure you or take you by the hand, which you need to navigate that successfully in order to go to work and be treated with dignity and respect. Now, if you think about that for a moment, that policies and procedures may serve to actively discourage people to vindicate their right to a workplace that supports their dignity and respect. That says an awful lot about the way that we frame and that we shape policy and procedure. Because for those of you who may not be fully familiar with the whole world of workplace bullying, and I hope that's most of you, whilst there's a huge disagreement internationally around what exactly bullying is, and there is no absolute definitional consensus, the one constant that everybody agrees on is that bullying is predicated on an unequal exercise or balance of power. There's always, in every bullying dynamic, there's an unequal balance of power. And if you go back to your policies and your procedures and you ask yourself, who does this policy or procedure best serve? And from my experience, it rarely will serve a vulnerable person. A person who, by definition, is at their lowest, at their weakest, at their most exposed. If, as I said, if you think that that is anything other than deliberate, you're incorrect.
I completely agree. The other piece I feel around it is we have very few, if any at all, examples where people have effectively sought redress and been able to work well in that space subsequently. It just doesn't exist. So that also tells us about the real problematics about all of this.
And I think too that so many people either will leave an institution or an organisation rather than, in inverted commas, cause any trouble, or will suffer in silence, or will get sick, or will die. So there are unknown numbers of people who have, been counselled out of their workplace, or who have suffered in silence for the few years until they've taken early retirement. And those are the unknown, the unheard voices and the unarticulated experiences that the institution is often very glad are unheard and is very glad that they're unarticulated, because it contradicts the PR rhetoric that they will engage with around their commitment to the protection of dignity and respect in the workplace. And, as I said, I would be very cynical about a lot of those campaigns, because you just have to keep asking yourself, who does this campaign, who does this policy best serve? The institution or the targeted vulnerable individual?
There's no doubt we have a lot of more work to do on this one, so we'll hopefully come back and talk to you again about this, Declan. But we can't not have a conversation about Peggy. So how is Peggy doing?
Peggy, for most of you who have no idea who Peggy is all of a sudden, Peggy is my Cocker Spaniel. And along with a colleague of mine, Dr. Shane Bergen, from the School of Education, UCD, we wrote a children's book called Peggy's Adventures in Science. And we have an accompanying website, Peggy, PEIGI.ie. And the purpose of this, it was funded by the Science Foundation Ireland. And the children's book has got mixed or twin social justice and science themes. So, for example, one of the stories has a little boy. So Peggy is the main character in the 4 stories in the book. And in one of the stories, Peggy's friend is on the train, and he leaves behind Peggy's birthday present, and they've got to follow the train in order to get the birthday present. But the little boy is in a wheelchair, so it's navigating public transport. So the science theme is transport and travel, and the social justice issue is access to transport for those who are disabled. And just before Christmas, I got a message from somebody who had gotten the book. The book was distributed free of charge to every primary school in Ireland, with all traveller sites and traveller centres. Every child in direct provision got a free copy. And it's available for the cost of post and packaging on from the website. So it's free of charge. So about 4,500 copies have gone out. But I received a text from a mother saying that her little boy was 6 and that he was a wheelchair user, and that he had just started wheelchair basketball. But he had gotten so excited when he had seen a character in a book, a boy in a wheelchair, and that would I record a message from Peggy to him to encourage him to continue on with the wheelchair basketball. And I said, you know what? Forget about all the papers. Forget about all the books. These are the things that actually show you are the markers of success when we're lying in our beds late at night.
Absolutely fantastic.
Yeah. I think it was such, like, the twin team, I think, was just such an incredible idea. And then the fact that it's just become so widespread to all the students. It's around 4 years of age, isn't it, Declan?
Yeah, it's for junior infants. It's for the lower end of the primary school. Just it's very, very simple. There's another story in which Peggy's going up into space, so it's called Blast Off Peggy. But that when she goes to try on the spacesuit, it's too big for her. And we got that story, and they have to adapt it. But we got that story from the case of some female astronauts who were going up to the space center, and the spacesuits had been designed for men and had to be adapted for them. So it's like, rooted in truth.
Brilliant. So where can people get access to that, Declan?
It's on two websites. It's on PEIGI, Peggy.ie, or Peggy'sAdventures.com. Again, PEIGIS ADVENTURES at Peggy'sAdventures.com. And they can be ordered from there.
Highly recommend. I think it's absolutely fantastic.
Absolutely. We can put the link in with the episode as well, anyway, for everyone who's interested.
For people to see.
Those episodes actually have the stories read in English and in Irish. And the book is also available in Braille format as well, and large print format.
Amazing.
Fantastic.
Amazing.
Yeah.
It's lovely to end on such a positive note, isn't it?
Good.
Yeah. Great to talk to you. And great to talk to someone who gets it. We're a niche group of researchers in this field, but our work talks to everyone. And like you, the stories that people share are really moving. I think you carry them with you always.
You do.
Actually, I don't forget them. You carry them with you always.
No.
So we can be voices for people when they can't be, and that's really important to us. So delighted to talk to you about that. Thank you so much.
No, it's a thrill, and thank you very much. I hope I didn't bore you all.
Not at all. Not for a second. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Declan. Always a pleasure.